From KUNC and the NPR network, this is In The NoCo. I'm Erin O'Toole. A new tax on the sale of guns and ammunition could be used to fund services that help crime victims. That's the idea behind a proposal Colorado voters will consider on the November ballot. Proposition KK would add a 6.5% tax on guns, some gun parts and accessories, and ammunition. It's a novel approach that its backers say will generate about $39 million a year to fund programs that address some of the harms of gun violence, including mental health services. But opponents say it will just make it more difficult for law-abiding Coloradans to buy guns. Here to explain more on what this unusual tax would do is KUNC State Capitol reporter Lucas Brady Woods. Hi, Lucas.
Hi, Erin. Thanks for having me.
Lucas, I want to lay out some of the groundwork for this ballot measure. Why have supporters chosen this rather unprecedented way to create funding to support victims of crime?
So essentially, some of these services, like you mentioned, victim services and some of the other things that would be funded by this ballot measure are seeing a lot of reductions in funding, at least according to one of the sponsors of this ballot measure, House Majority Leader Monica Duran, one of the top Democrats at the State House.
We are in a severe situation. We are at risk because of all the drops in funding of not only losing services, which we have to turn away. People already were struggling, right? But also jobs. The very people who provide the counseling, the therapy, connect you to, hotel vouchers, meals, different services.
She's told me about a bunch of sort of drawbacks in federal funding and other funding for some of these services, and they're very needed. She's a champion of this, and she wanted to come up with a funding stream for some of these services that's outside the state budget, outside of federal funding, and so that's where this came from. It's really to create a steady funding stream for victim services and some of the other services that this funds.
Lucas, as we mentioned earlier, the tax is expected to generate around $39 million a year to fund support services for crime victims. How would that money be spent?
So the vast majority of that $39 million will go to some of the jobs that serve this population of crime victims. Mm-hmm. We're talking the counselors, the therapists, and then, some of the people that connect crime victims with hotel vouchers, meals, things like that, other housing. And some of those are the things that the proponents of this measure are worried about losing because of the lack of funding and the lack of support. So the vast majority of the money raised, about $30 million, would go to crime victim services. Mm-hmm. The rest of it is divvied up as well. About $5 million would go to veteran mental health services. $3 million would go to at-risk youth, specifically for suicide prevention, and then $1 million would go to school safety. Anything over that raised by this, because remember, this is an estimate. That's an estimate of how much it would raise every year. So it could raise more, it could raise less. Anything over that $39 million projected would have to be returned to the taxpayers. That's because of TABOR, which is Colorado's Taxpayer Bill of Rights. And what that does is it essentially says, if the government collects more revenue than they originally projected, they have to give that extra revenue back to the taxpayers.
I'd like to talk about the opposition to Proposition KK. Opponents say it would just make it harder for people, law-abiding residents of Colorado who want to buy a gun, to do that. Are there other objections to Proposition KK?
Not a whole lot of very loud ones, I will say. The two areas that I've seen that are opposed to this are gun ownership activists, gun rights activists, mm-hmm. and people who are against increases in taxes. So those are kind of the two cores here. I think the more vocal will be the Second Amendment supporters and their claims that this infringes on Coloradans' Second Amendment rights by adding a little bit of a barrier to purchasing a firearm. Mm-hmm. But according to Majority Leader Duran, who, as I said, sponsored this would amount to about an increase of about $1 for a box of ammunition, mm-hmm. and about $35 increase for a handgun, for example. So according to her, it's a minimal price increase. But again, that is probably one of the loudest opposition talking points is that it adds a barrier to legal gun ownership. For her, this is more about funding the victims and providing services for those victims as opposed to deterring firearm ownership at all.
I'm wondering about the unintended consequences of this proposition. I would imagine people who don't want to pay this additional 6.5% tax would just go to another state to make their purchases. What does the data show?
I'm not super familiar with the exact data on that, but I do know that this happens, right? People do go to other states and buy guns, states that have less stringent laws. And, I think that there are more stringent gun controls that motivate people to do that more than a small financial burden like this tax. I think things like the waiting periods or the red flag laws, things like that would potentially motivate people to go to other states to buy guns.
So how optimistic are supporters that this will pass in November?
Well, they're pretty confident. There has been some opposition, but it's not as loud as it is for some other measures or some other gun control measures we've even seen in the past. So I think they're feeling pretty good. They're definitely out trying to get the message out about this. And sure. We'll see what happens in November. Of course, we don't want to make any predictions. There's a lot of people who don't want to pay more taxes. There's a lot of people in Colorado who don't want any controls on gun purchases. So we'll have to see.
So in the past dozen years, trying to pass gun safety rules in Colorado has been a mixed bag. Does this idea of a tax on firearms and ammunition feel like a more palatable approach to backers than something like an assault weapons ban?
Short answer is yes. I do think that's absolutely right. I think there's a spectrum of gun control measures that we've seen over the last few years. Like you said, it's a mixed bag where things like the assault weapons ban will get really strong opposition, but other ones that are maybe a little bit more moderated in their approach might get less opposition. And I think that gun rights groups really sort of pick and choose where they put their opposition resources and really try to sort of focus on the assault weapons ban, put their resources there, because as you also said, there's been a lot of gun control policies put forward in the last couple of years.
Well, Lucas Brady Woods, thank you so much for talking with me today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Lucas Brady Woods covers politics and state government for KUNC. Proposition KK is one of 14 statewide measures on Colorado ballots this November. You'll find a handy guide to those measures and more election coverage in our show notes and at KUNC.org. While you're there, sign up for our weekly In The NoCo newsletter. You'll get news updates delivered to your inbox every Wednesday. Just enter your email address and you're all set. That's it for us today on In The NoCo. I'm Erin O'Toole. Thank you so much for listening.